Government of Mauritius adopted a holistic approach whereby the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council and National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Center was set up in October 2013. In December 2014, a greater commitment was demonstrated by the newly elected government to the inclusion of disaster management as a separate entity within the restricted Ministry of Environment, Sustainable Development and Disaster and Beach Management. As such, Mauritius now has a minister responsible for the portfolio of disaster management. The Honorable Dayal, Minister of Environment, Sustainable Development and Disaster and Beach Management, will very soon introduce the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Bill in the National Assembly. Pending the enactment of the bill and with a view to making timely and effective arrangement for the imminent cyclonic and rainy seasons, Cabinet has, as a matter of priority, agreed to the setting up the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council to oversee disaster management activities in Mauritius and the outer islands. The National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Center to act as the main institution for the state of Mauritius for the planning, organizing, coordinating and monitoring of disaster risk reduction and management activities at all levels. The Local Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Committee in the Municipal City Council, the Municipal Town Council and the District Council to manage disaster risk reduction in the respective localities. A Rodrigues Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council. In fifth, a Rodrigues Disaster and Risk Reduction and Management Center. The Government of Mauritius is also in the process of upgrading the capabilities of the meteorological services through the induction of Doppler weather radar, the development and operation as an automated flood monitoring system in flood-prone areas, integrated with the Doppler radar, and in order to give timely warning and alert to the first responders and the general public against hydrometeorological events. Such system is already in place in the neighboring French island of Ile de la Réunion. We believe that having an emergency warning system is the key solution to responding to natural disasters. The Government of Mauritius is in the process of implementing a unified and coordinated multi-hazard national early warning and emergency alert system for the issue of timely, coordinated and efficient dissemination of alerts, warning and advisories to the general public and key stakeholders in time of emergencies and disasters. Indeed, Mauritius is the first among seas to have put in place an early warning system for storm and digital tidal surges. The coastal communities in Mauritius have at least 3 hours warning of possible incoming surges to evacuate safely. The Government of Mauritius is also working on a pilot project for setting up an emergency shelter to local inhabitants exposed to landslide, storm surge, cyclones, etc. At Capsule, a coastal village in Mauritius, the project is being funded under the Coastal Zone Management Project in Mauritius by the Adaptation Fund Board as part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We hope that COP21, which is scheduled to be held at the end of this month in Paris, will strengthen action on adaptation in the Paris Agreement and in particular scale up adaptation finance for small island developing states and cities. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I will just have some more inputs for the second World Conference on Disaster. I will just hand over to the chairperson. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. There was many interesting points in your remarks. I was quite intrigued by the movement that is happening in Mauritius in recent months, the move towards bringing about the legislation. I was also quite struck by your initial remarks about looking at the larger context of risk and how environmental hazards are creating new health risks of communicable diseases. So thank you very much for that. Now we move on to looking at what is happening in the world humanitarian arena, and I invite Harjeet Singh. He spearheads ActionAid's global advocacy work on climate change issues to talk about World Humanitarian Summit.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Kamal Kishore, distinguished panelists and eminent guests and audience. It's my privilege to be here and speaking this morning. As Mr. Kamal Kishore was talking about, 2015 and 2016 are very important year in terms of global discourse. What I'm going to do, yes, I have to talk about World Humanitarian Summit, but I'm going to go a little beyond my brief and try to make it a bit more relevant looking at the audience. So the World Humanitarian Summit is first of its kind, being organized to bring experts, governments, professionals, communities together to look at the humanitarian challenge. And I'm so glad that the kind of audience we have here, UN organizations, armed forces, police, and then practitioners, everybody who is so involved with the humanitarian work. So I'm going to highlight a couple of things which we all should take note of in the changing context. So that's the purpose of World Humanitarian Summit, is to look at some of the global challenges, is to learn from each other's experience, is to look at it how we can work together as a global community. And there's a very intense process that's happening, but before I talk about the process, I must just touch upon the kind of challenge we are facing. So there are 60 million people who were forced out of their homes just due to conflict and violence, and half of them are children. In the last 2 decades, 218 million people, which is 21 crore, were affected each year on an average, and we lost $300 billion every year on an average in the last 2 decades. So that's the kind of challenge we are facing, and these disasters are increasing and their impacts are becoming more and more intense in the last few years, and the trend is going to only get worse. And that's why this humanitarian summit is extremely important. They have been doing consultations for the last 18 months. They've had 8 regional consultations. They have reached out to 23,000 people. They've listened to a lot of experts, and then they are going to come up with some kind of a guiding document. And they've also agreed upon 5 different areas that they are going to help categorize all the work that we are doing. So these 5 areas are dignity, safety, resilience, partnership, and finance. So issues that we were talking about in this morning about community participation, making sure that women are involved, vulnerable people are involved, all that is under dignity, how we really work very closely with community, recognize their knowledge, not just seeing them as victims, but involving them at all different levels. And that's about dignity part of it, and taking care of them. The second bit, safety, is also about how do we involve community and look at all the safety aspects, especially about children. We know what kind of abuse happens in post-disaster situations, working with women. And then, of course, the third area about resilience. The police commissioner was talking about how preparing in advance is far more important than just responding, and it's far more cheaper. And then, of course, the areas of partnership, working with all different stakeholders and the finance needed. So that's what's happening at the global level. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, because that process is going to conclude in May this year in Turkey, when different governments are going to come, heads of the states are going to arrive, and they are going to adopt this document. There's already a synthesis paper that's available online. These are some of the highlights. As I said, there are 5 different areas, and a lot of information is being captured. What I'm going to do is to talk about some of the issues that are absolutely relevant to us, people sitting here. What's changing, what has been changing in the last 2 decades, and what will continue to change, is the increasing complexity of disasters. The humanitarian situations we are facing are very different from what we used to face earlier. I'm sure you must be aware of the Syrian refugee crisis, how the entire Europe is battling. I'm sure you must have read that while the Syrian refugee crisis is linked to war, but the root causes have also been linked with climate change. So it's the drought that actually had a spiral effect, and then it got really complex with the whole war situation. So now you will see more and more disasters where the complexity is a lot more. There is a term called protracted crisis, and Food and Agriculture Organization, another UN organization, has defined that term when you have prolonged conflict situation or a natural disaster combined with food insecurity, and then you have very weak governance system. And they've categorized 22 countries that are going through that protected crisis. You can understand it's a concoction of so many crises, and it's extremely difficult to deal with that situation. We are talking of fragile states. If I talk about India, if I talk about Asia, Afghanistan is one of those countries, or Tajikistan. How do we deal with that complex humanitarian situation? It's not simple where you have just one kind of a disaster and you can go and deal with it with your response system and start working towards it. It's extremely complex. The document is also talking about chronic inequality. And when we talk about inequality, it's about social inequality, income inequality, rich are becoming richer, poor are getting poorer, which means that now we are dealing with a far more unequal world. Some people have far more resources than most. As per some data, over 80 people in the world have as much money as half of the population has, all put together. That's the kind of global inequality we are dealing with. And that also has a very strong input into the kind of humanitarian situations we are seeing. Conflicts are increasing. We talked about climate change. Honorable Commissioner also talked about climate change and the important summit that's going to happen in the next few days, in fact, in Paris, which is battling terror at this moment. So you look at the complex situations we are facing every now and then. Since I talked about climate change, let me say a couple of things. The global average temperature has already risen by 1 degree Celsius. And the reason you are seeing number of disasters, both intensity and frequency increasing, it is linked to the global average temperature rise by 1 degree. And that is linked to greenhouse gas emissions. In simple terms, it's pollution. You know, our cars and vehicles and forest fires and destruction of forest and what not. All these reasons and the kind of agriculture we are doing, all these reasons are responsible for the climate crisis we are facing. Of course, the rich world is more responsible because industrialization happened there much earlier in the last 150 years. But now India and China are also emitting a lot of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So how do we actually deal with that, and what are the impacts? So we are going to see more and more disasters, and in the last few years we have seen Kashmir floods, Uttarakhand floods, Cyclone Hudhud, Cyclone Phailin, and many more disasters. Drought situations are increasing. As humanitarian community, are we really ready? We are talking of different challenges. We are still talking about lack of resources, lack of capacity. If these disasters are going to hit us much more frequently, are we ready with that system? That means they are going to erode the years and decades of development in just one shot. Are we ready with that? I don't think our systems are ready, whether we talk about India or majority of developing countries. And I would say the current discourse is not taking that challenge into account. The current level of emissions are going to take us to a 3-degree temperature rise scenario. If we still do what we have promised to do, and that's what Paris Summit in the next few weeks is going to talk about. And let me warn you, 3-degree temperature rise does not mean 3 times of the impacts we are facing. It may mean 30 times. Climate system is extremely complex. Are we ready with 30 times of disasters, or let's say 5 times of disasters what we have faced in the last few years? I don't think we are ready for that. But that's a reality. It's a real scenario we are heading towards. But we, as a society, as governance system, we have not really understood this challenge well. Now, disasters are linked with migration, and let me share a data. Last year, 19.3 million people were forced out of their homes by disasters. And out of that, 90% were weather-related disasters. So you can understand. And 87% of people who were displaced were from Asia. And India, China, and Philippines happen to be, big countries contributing to that number. And there's a direct relationship between weather-related disasters, climate change. So that's the kind of impact. We are in the coastal area. I've seen the schedule and there we are going to have number of sessions. I did not find any session specifically talking about sea level rise, and I'm going to challenge you on that. We are talking of all good things. We're talking of child-centered resilience, we're talking of urban, we're talking of some very important issues, but we are not talking of new challenges. We are not talking of protracted crisis, as I was mentioning, when different crises are going to come together. We are not talking of sea level rise. Sea level is rising by several meters. 1 degree temperature rise. In fact, there was a very recent study which talks about how in Mumbai itself, 5.8 million people are going to be affected if the temperature rises by 2 degrees Celsius. And if it rises by 4 degrees, number of people who are going to get impacted just in Mumbai is 11 million. And here we are in the coastal area, we are not talking of sea level rise. India, which has a coastline of 7,500 kilometer long coastline, are we talking about it? Glacial melt. Oceans are going to get acidic. We were talking of fishing community. Fishing community depends on oceans. Oceans are getting more and more acidic. That temperature is rising. The whole fish stock is moving to a totally different direction. Are we talking about those big challenges? It's clearly linked with disaster management. There are some slow onset disasters that we are not talking about. Glacial melt means more floods and loss of fresh water. Are we talking about it? So I think we have some very, very important challenges which we need to talk about. And if in 2015, if we don't talk about these new challenges, then when? I'll say a couple of more things. One, the whole issue of natural resources. If you look at the conflicts, most of these conflicts are around natural resources, whether it's for oil, gas, or forest, or whatever. Natural resource happens to be at the center of conflict and also linked with climate change. You destroy a natural resource, you will see more climate change. And climate change is also destroying natural resources. So it's an extremely complex scenario again. How do you look at natural resource management as a very important part of the development and how you can fix it? I think that's another important thing. There are some global issues. The whole militarization of aid, we are seeing it happening in Afghanistan and many parts of Africa. How do you look at that? How do you look at trade and aid issues coming together? How do you look at aid versus the whole tax issue? There are some extremely complex issues, and I'm deliberately not talking of conventional challenges which we have still not dealt with, and here we are facing many new challenges which are far, far more complex. So I'm going to urge you and challenge you to pick up some of these important sessions. I'm sure you're talking about coastal issues. When you talk about coastal issues, please do talk about sea level rise. When you're talking about mountainous issues in the mountainous regions, talk about glacial retreat, talk about glacial melt. We generally don't use these terminologies. We don't talk about increasing salinization, which is kind of a slow disaster, but it is killing our agriculture. Imagine a country where 58% of people still depend on agriculture. In our country, if we don't talk about it, and globally, majority of developing countries also depend on agriculture. So these are some of the big challenges I just wanted to highlight. And I'm not giving a lot of answers, but I'm raising a lot of questions. That's what my job as a keynote speaker. And to convince you, to urge you to talk about some of those issues in the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harjeet, for highlighting some of the big challenges, emerging disaster risk scenario, highlighting that a 3 degree centigrade rise in global temperature from 1 degree is not 3 times, but it's an exponential increase. Big issues of what will happen to migration patterns, people relocating in areas where we're losing land to sea level rise. What happens to freshwater availability if glacial melt accelerates, and so on. So these are big issues, and although right now we refer to these as slow onset disasters, but one worries that at one point the scales will have tipped and they will no longer be slow onset disasters. It is going to hit us with a speed that we are not really prepared for. So thank you for reminding all of this. I think it should really be front and center of all our discussions on disaster risk management. In Sendai this year, 4 priorities were decided. The first was understanding risk, and the second was improving governance of risk management. And we are lucky to have a professor from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor Amita Singh. May I now invite her to address us.
A very good morning to all of you. After all the wonderful papers that you've calmly listened to, I hope I turn out to be last but not the least. And when you walk out of this room, you will feel that I did do justice with my role as a teacher who's gathered a lot of information in the last 3 years since we started working on disasters. When I speak here, I am not speaking my mind. I speak here the information, the knowledge, and the wisdom that has come to me through my association with the Disaster Research Program at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Not each one of the partners could have come and spoken here, so I mentioned their names here, Dr. Sunita Reddy, Professor Mandira Datta, and Mr. Sanjeev Kumar. We've been working together. There are others back home who were not able to come. I also would try to express here the views that we have gathered with our first Congress that we had at Uttarakhand at the bank of Ganga, not in air-conditioned rooms, but over the broken rocks that were flowing down from the mountains. So the minister from Himachal Pradesh would understand that we did start a whole understanding about disasters from the mountainous region, and that was where the whole of the Asia Pacific Governance Group, which is NAPSIPAC, which is sitting here with me, has been contributing information from the rivers, from the mountains, and also the very porous boundaries that we share in South Asia. And we also melt down and mollify much of our national arrogance in each of these countries and come forward and join hands with others in disaster mitigation. I could have spoken and I had planned to speak something else here, but after listening to everyone here, there is hardly anything which is left, but there is something, a huge factor which is left out. You have listened to all of them. Now, let me communicate with you. Please share your patience with me. There were men who came and spoke. There was a woman who spoke. Now, if for some time we divide the society and the decision makers between men and women, what do you get as a compendium from women and what do you get as a compendium from men? And